G'day guys, we finally have the index for World Eaters in our hands, so let's have a look at what these blood-soaked maniacs can do in 10th edition Warhammer 40k.
Look for the blood god.
Alright, we've already seen what the army rule Blessings of Khorne can do, and we've seen the detachment giving you +1 strength and attack on the charge. What we've got new today is the enhancements, so let's have a look at how you can power up your characters in your 10th edition World Eaters army. Alright, first up we have the Favoured of Khorne, World Eaters model only, and each time you make a Blessings of Khorne roll, before doing anything else, the bearer can use this enhancement. If it does, discard all the dice from that roll and make a new Blessings of Khorne roll. This new roll does not count as a reroll, so the rules that enable you to reroll or manipulate individual dice, for example the Icon of Khorne, can still be used. Alright, straight out of the gate, this is already a really powerful ability. We've already seen the amazing things that you can do with your Blessings of Khorne, however, they're not all guaranteed, and being able to reroll that entire pool greatly increases your chances of getting the more powerful abilities from that Favoured of Khorne. In particular, the ability to resurrect Angron, because in order to do that you need to roll 8 dice, and 3 of those need to be a 6. So being able to reroll the entire result is really powerful, and it combos with other abilities in this codex that allow you to reroll individual dice. So for example, if you're trying to resurrect Angron and you roll the first pool of dice and you get no 6s, you might reroll the whole lot. Whereas if you roll the whole pool and you get 2 6s, you might use one of your Icons of Khorne or your Lord of Skulls' ability in order to change one of those dice into a 6, giving you the third 6 that you require in order to resurrect the big boy. And resurrecting Angron, he's already so hard to kill, but being able to resurrect him at full health is going to be an absolute pivotal ability for World Eaters armies to dominate on the tabletop. Alright, next up we have the Berzerkers Glaive. Add 1 to the attacks and damage characteristic of melee weapons equipped by the bearer, and each time the bearer ends a charge move, roll 1d3, and until the end of the turn, add the result of that roll to the attacks and damage characteristic of those melee weapons instead. Wow, being able to add d3 to your attacks and your damage characteristic of melee weapons you're equipped with is going to turn some of these World Eaters characters into absolute murderous beatsticks. I'm thinking the Master of Executions is going to be a really good candidate for this because his weapon does devastating wounds. So it's 2 damage, and every 6 that you roll is going to do 2 mortal wounds. However, if you use this enhancement, you're going to be getting plus D3 to that. So your ability to go in and do 2 plus D3 mortal wounds is going to be really strong, and he gets to reroll all of his hit and wound rolls against character targets. So that's going to mean you're more likely to get those, and you're more likely to be able to snipe characters out of the targets that you're going in for. This is really exciting. It's also really cool on things like a Daemon Prince or a Juggernaut Lord, so there's plenty of options, and this is just a really good way of really dialing up the damage of these blood-soaked crazy killers. Alright, next we have Battle Lust. So you can select the bearer's unit for the Heroic Intervention stratagem for 0 CP, and you can do so even if you've already targeted a different unit with that stratagem this phase. Alright, so this is really spicy. Being able to heroically intervene for free on its own is really powerful, but being able to do it in the same phase as another unit means that you're going to be able to heroically intervene with 2 units at the same time. Again, you put this on a Master of Executions in a unit of Berzerkers, he confers always fights first to that unit, which means you're going to be able to heroically intervene with multiple things and then fight first across multiple fronts. This is going to be really crazy, and I look forward to seeing it on the tabletop. And then last but absolutely not least, we have Helm of Brazen Ire. Each time an attack is allocated to the bearer, halve the damage characteristic of that attack. Alright, there's a really spicy combo that we will get into later, which is basically where you take a Daemon Prince and he provides insane aura buffs to nearby units. However, the Daemon Prince himself can be targeted. So I personally think that this Helm of Brazen Ire is a really strong option for the Daemon Prince because it's going to keep him alive longer, which is going to allow him to continue to provide those aura buffs to your nearby units. So that's the 4 enhancements that we have in the World Eaters Index, and every single one of them is very, very strong. So I look forward to seeing which ones people take on their lists, and when we get the points cost and we start working out lists, I'll definitely hit you guys back with some of my hot takes and some of my best combos that I can find, and we'll develop that together. Alrighty, let's have a look at some of the stratagems that are going to be available to World Eaters with this new index. There's some really, really spicy stuff in here that's going to combo really, really interestingly with some of the units and data sheets that we have available. So let's dig through them together, shall we? First, we have Gory Massacre. It's used in the fight phase. It's used on one World Eaters unit from your army that made a charge move this turn and destroyed one or more enemy units. And the effect is, in your opponent's next command phase, each enemy unit within 6 inches of your unit must take a Battle Shock test. If the unit taking this test is below half strength, subtract 1 from enemy units affected by this stratagem. They do not need to take any other Battle Shock tests in the same phase. Alright, so this one's pretty cool, being able to go in there, charge something, kill it, and then anything within 6 inches of you in their command phase is going to have to take Battle Shock. That's really, really powerful. It's going to mean that you're interacting with your opponent's primary by stopping them from scoring objectives, because Battle Shock units are reduced to OC 0. And it also means that you're going to be able to stop them from being able to use stratagems, things of that nature, which is going to make it a lot easier for you to interact with their army and a lot harder for them to interact with yours. So pretty cool stratagem, but of the stratagems available, this is actually one of my least favorites. Some of the spicy ones are coming up. Alright, next we have For the Skull Throne. So it's used in the fight phase on a World Eaters unit from your army that has not been selected to fight yet this phase. Until the end of the phase, each time a model in that unit makes a melee attack that targets a character, monster, or vehicle, you get to add 1 to the wound roll. Alrighty, so it's just like the old Veterans of the Long War from the previous Chaos Space Marine Codex, only it's only 1 command point, and it's going to be really, really powerful, especially in an edition where vehicles, monsters, and characters all just got significantly tougher, which is going to make it harder for your things like Berserkers to chew through. So being able to access that +1 to wound is going to be critical. It's also worth noting that this works on character units. Now, if a character joins a unit and becomes an attached unit, that is treated as 1 unit for all rules purposes, which means that is a unit with the character keyword, so you can use this stratagem to get +1 to wound when targeting that unit. So really, really incentivizes you to go in and hunt down those units that are trying to hide characters, and go in there and obliterate them and dig those characters out, drag them kicking and screaming, and claim their skulls for Khorne. Alright, next we have For the Blood God. So you use it in the fight phase just after a World Eaters unit from your army destroys an enemy unit. You use it on that World Eaters unit, and you make a Blessings of Khorne roll. You can use the results of this roll to activate 1 Blessing of Khorne. That Blessing of Khorne does not count towards your maximum number activated Blessings of Khorne, but all other rules for Blessings of Khorne apply. Alright, so this one's really interesting. You use it after killing an enemy unit in melee. So if your opponent goes first and they stay out of melee with you, you're going to be using this in essentially the last phase of the battle round, which means it's not going to be of a massive amount of utility, because you're basically going to refresh it in the very next phase. The only exception to that is if you're going to try to resurrect Angron, and this essentially gives you another shot at doing that, which is really cool. But if you go first, there's also some interesting stuff here. So you're going to kill them in the melee phase, which means the things that buff your melee, your movement distance, advance, and charge, they're not particularly relevant, because you're not going to get another movement phase before you reset this in the next battle round. But things like being able to always fight on death is a really cool one to activate. The Feel No Pain is a really cool one to activate. There's a whole ton of things that you can use this on in the fight phase that are going to last until the next battle round. So this is a really interesting stratagem and is going to have some niche abilities. I'm particularly interested in it in that it gives us another opportunity to try to resurrect Angron. So we've already seen that the probability of resurrecting Angron is relatively low, but when you stack on the fact that we can re-roll those rolls, we get this as an ability to do it multiple times per battle round, and then you also have units that are going to be able to give you re-rolls on top of that. There's some really interesting ways that we can make it so that it's very likely that you're going to be bringing back the Red Angel. Alright, next we have one with an interesting name, Khorne Cares Not. So in the fight phase, just after an enemy unit has selected its targets, 1 World Eaters unit from your army that was selected as one of those targets from 1 or more enemy units' attacks. Until the end of the phase, each time an attack targets your unit, subtract 1 from the damage characteristic of the attack. All right, so it's pretty expensive at 2 command points, and it doesn't really make sense calling it Khorne Cares Not because you're using it to protect one of your units, when in reality, if Khorne didn't care, he'd be just as happy with your units dying as he would with enemy units. So naming conventions aside, this is really, really powerful. Being able to subtract the damage of 1 means that if your opponent goes at you with 2 damage weapons, you can effectively halve the damage that they're going to put into you, which is going to make your units really, really, really durable. Further to that, if you're going into something that, say, they're 3 damage and you're Terminators, being able to subtract 1 from their damage characteristic also doubles your durability, because previously every shot that got through would kill a Terminator or an 8-bound or whatever, but now they're going to require 2 shots to get through in order to kill you. So there's multiple different ways that you can use this stratagem to double the durability or halve the damage capacity of your opponent's units. And that's really, really spicy and is going to be very clutch. It's also worth noting you can use this on things like Angron, on things like a Lord of Skulls. You can use this on your really big, tough units as well. It's not limited in any capacity. So it just means that our tough stuff just got a whole ton tougher. All right, next we have Blood Offering. You use it in any phase. You target it on one World Eater's unit from your army that was destroyed while it was within range of an objective marker that you controlled. You can use this stratagem on that unit even though it was just destroyed, and the effect is that that objective marker remains under your control even if you have no models within range of it until your opponent controls it at the start or end of any turn. Alright, so this is just a really good insulation in the shooting matchup, because one of the problems that World Eaters have often faced is that they just get shot off objective markers and then they have to walk out into the open to reclaim them while your opponent just keeps blasting you from downrange. Well, that's not going to work anymore. Now, your opponent can shoot you off that backfield objective, but in order for them to stop you from scoring it, they're going to have to send their units into your lines to take that from you, which means that you're going to be able to, in some matchups, you're going to be able to leave your backfield abandoned, run forward, and if they try and shoot you off those backfield objectives, shoot those couple of spawn off it, shoot those Jakhals off that objective, it's not going to matter. You're going to be able to cap that objective anyway, which is going to help us with our primary scoring in this very, very tight and intense game. And last but not least, we have Honor the Prince. Apoplectic Frenzy. Your movement phase, one World Eaters unit from your army that's not been selected to move this phase until the end of the phase. If the unit advances, do not make an advance roll for it. Instead, until the end of the movement phase, add 6 to the movement characteristic of models in your unit. Alright, so this one is just straight up fire. Being able to add 6 inches to something that has the capacity to advance and charge via those blood offerings, the Blessings of Khorne. Being able to just go, cool, I'm going to move my 8-bound up, they're 9 inches. I'm going to get +2 movement from the Blessings of Khorne. Then I'm going to advance 6. Then I'm going to charge 2d6. You're going to be able to just send these guys across the table like missiles. They are just as fast as they ever were, even though they lost the pre-game move from the in Lord Invocatus, and they've got some different stuff in the way that they get their different movement shenanigans. They are still just as fast and just as terrifying on the tabletop, and this stratagem goes a long way towards facilitating that. So this is a really exciting one, and I think this is also going to pull off some really interesting surprise moves. When you've got those Berserkers inside a Rhino somewhere, and they disembark out their 3, then they move their 6 inches, plus their 2, then +6 from the advance, and then they charge their 2d6. You're going to be sending Berserkers at insane speeds that people are not going to anticipate, because they're going to be like, oh yeah, Berserkers in Rhino, what are they, infantry? What do they move, like 6 inches? And it's like, well no, they actually move their 6 inches plus effectively an additional 8 inches from the various buffs that you can put on them, which just absolutely makes them function almost like jump pack units. So this one I think is going to be one of those ones that you're going to want to save CP for, because it's going to help get you out of those tricky situations. Alrighty, that's the stratagems from the World Eaters Codex, or Index. Let me know what you guys think. I personally think that almost every single one of these stratagems has significant impact on the game, and one of the hardest things World Eaters are going to have to deal with is deciding which stratagems to prioritize, because all of them are really good. Being able to use the Khorne Cares Not to increase the durability of your units is something that's going to be really, really clutch. But sometimes you're going to want to pivot into more of an aggressive and use your command points on advance and charge. So deciding when to pivot from that defensive playstyle into an aggressive playstyle is going to be something that is going to be a skill that World Eaters are going to have to master in order to dominate the tabletops. So let me know which stratagems you think are the best, and let's get into the next section. Alrighty guys, let's have a look at Angron's new data sheet. Now this lad is an absolute beatstick. He's lost a lot of his strategic play and a lot of his options from the previous codex, but he's gained a lot as well. So let's have a look. First of all, he lost his ability to prevent enemy units from falling back. And he also lost the ability to turn off objective secured, which is essentially your objective control stat in the previous edition. And these two things were some of the things that made Angron very popular, was the fact that he stopped your opponent from being able to fall back, which allowed him to lock you in combat with him, and then he also stopped you from being able to control those objectives, which put your opponent in a really tricky spot, and it was a lot of fun to wield him. He's lost that. However, what he's gained, I think, more than makes up for it. Now, he's a non-titanic monster, which means he's able to hide behind ruined walls. You can't target him if you can't draw a clean line to any part of that model, which means he's much easier to keep alive. Further to that, he's now toughness 11, which means that things like infantry-mounted las cannons, melter guns, all of those sorts of weapons, even autocannons that used to be able to wound him with relative ease, now are going to really, really struggle to wound him. And he's still got that 4-up invulnerable save, he's still got a large number of wounds, he's still got that 2-up armor save, in an addition where armor penetration is much lower than it previously was. So all of these things combine to make him way, way tougher than he used to be. It's almost not even in the same ballpark. He is so much tougher than he used to be. Further to that, when you resurrect him now, which granted is very difficult to do compared to what it used to be, but when you do resurrect him, he comes back with the full wounds remaining, which means your opponent is going to have to put serious firepower, serious investment just to kill this guy. And then when he comes back, he's coming back at full health. And that's going to be so demoralizing for your opponent that I think a lot of people, when they put Angron on the table, a lot of people are just going to ignore him. A lot of people are going to go, I don't want to waste my valuable resources killing this guy, because there's a small chance that you're just going to bring him back and all of that's going to be wasted. So they're going to let him run around and just kill things, and they'll only really go for him if you put him in a position where they can kill him without really sacrificing their greater game plan. And that, I think, is going to make Angron a must-take in most World Eaters lists competitively, depending on how many points he is. We're obviously going to have balanced data slates, so his points are going to change up and down over time. But as long as he's competitively costed, I think he's going to be a very, very useful unit in a World Eaters army, just because of that ability to be resurrected and come back and be tough and do consistent, serious amounts of damage. And he also does provide some interesting buffs for your units. Being able to give +1 to charge is going to be really, really valuable. Being able to put reroll hits on units is going to really increase the damage output in an edition where damage output has generally been reduced. So I'm really excited for Angron. I think he's going to be an absolute maniac on the tabletop, as he should be. And I think he's also going to be a really hard thing to put down, which is something that I really think he should have been from the get-go. So it's good to see him reflecting that really tough, really scary, really powerful combatant on the tabletop, what you would expect from a Demon Primarch. Let me know in the comments section below what you think of the new Angron data sheet. Do you think he's all that, or do you think he's a bit of a miss? Do you think you're going to miss his old abilities and his old tricks, or do you prefer the new raw power and raw durability that he brings to the World Eaters armies? Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. Alrighty, let's have a look at Kharn the Betrayer, everybody's favorite murdering psychopath, everybody's favorite disloyal heretic, Kharn the Betrayer. So, he's changed pretty dramatically in the role that he fills in a World Eaters army now. Now, you can pretty safely attach him to World Eaters units, and basically in the charge phase, if he's not within engagement range of enemy models, you take a leadership check, and if he fails, one model from his bodyguard unit is destroyed. Now, he's got pretty high leadership, pretty strong leadership, so it's unlikely that this is going to happen, and it also is negated if he is in combat, which is, to be honest, where he should be as often as possible anyway. So this means that you're not likely to take casualties the way you used to. He used to be a serious liability in World Eaters lists. Now, he's seriously really valuable. Further to that, he used to be pretty much just a solo operative. He was somebody that did damage, really high damage, but that was more or less all he did. Whereas now, he's providing aura buffs to your units. Being able to reroll those hit rolls of 1 and those wound rolls of 1 is just going to mean that any unit of Berserkers that he is attached to is just going to be way more consistent, way more reliable, and put out generally more damage than they otherwise would, Provided he's not hyper expensive, I think this is an absolutely insanely good value upgrade for a World Eaters unit. The other thing worth noting here is that Kharn the Betrayer always fights on death. So even if your opponent does hit you hard, kill all the Berserkers, and then kill Kharn, your Berserkers are likely going to be fighting on death on a 4+ if you've spent the abilities to do so. But further to that, they are going to be giving him the ability to fight on death regardless, which is really, really strong, and it means that no matter what happens, Gorechild is going to be coming to bear and swinging that chain axe. The other thing worth noting is that if you do add Kharn the Betrayer to a Berserker unit, when that unit is shot, every time a Berserker dies, you get to make a Blood Surge move with Kharn the Betrayer. It's no longer just the World Eater Berserker unit, you're actually doing it with the characters that are attached to the unit as well, because that unit is treated as one for all rules purposes. Which means if you put Kharn all the way at the front of that unit, Berserker's trailing back, and then your opponent hits you, you remove one of the Berserkers from the back of the unit, you make your Blood Surge move, and you launch Kharn forward into them. Which means people are going to be really, really scared of Kharn the Betrayer. You cannot afford to be anywhere near those Berserker units when they are making those Blood Surge moves if they're packing a character like Kharn the Betrayer nested away inside. Let me know what you guys think of Kharn the Betrayer. Do you think he's an interesting new data sheet? Is this something that you're going to be adding into your list? I, for one, absolutely love Kharn the Betrayer, as you can probably guess. I've pretty much modeled my entire brand around this blood-soaked maniac, and I am so excited that he is looking like he's going to be highly competitively viable, and he's going to be playing on the tabletop the way you would want him to play. He's not doing more damage to you than the enemy. Sometimes he'll do damage to you, but that's generally because you didn't give him what he wanted, and that is skulls. And if you don't give him those skulls, he's going to take them one way or another. So being able to aggressively wield him, get Blood Surge moves to launch him further into combat, and do serious damage with him whilst he buffs those Berserkers nearby because they want to impress him. So they're getting reroll 1s to hit, they're getting reroll 1s to wound. He's going in with Gorechild doing massive damage. I just think that's going to make for a really interesting little unit. And it also means that when you put stratagems on that unit, like +1 to wound in melee, that's going to apply to Kharn as well as all of the Berserkers. So these units are going to have massive damage potential. Alright, now let's have a look at the Lord Invocatus. Now this guy was previously one of the top units in the World Eaters Codex. It was something that everybody took without even questioning it because he provided a pre-game move to your units, which was really, really valuable. However, now that is baked into the data sheets of those 8-bound. So a lot of people are thinking, well, you don't really need the Lord Invocatus anymore. However, the thing that's worth noting is he still provides it to things like Exalted 8-bound. And Exalted 8-bound can now be taken in units of 6. So now, instead of going, okay, we have to take regular 8-bound because they're core and they have the keywords required for using the stratagems, you can actually attach Lord Invocatus to a unit of Exalted 8-bound and then pre-game move them in a similar fashion to what we used to do with regular 8-bound, which is going to make this guy really, really crazy. But let's have a look at some of the things that he does specifically when attached to a unit. Alright, we've already talked about how you can attach him to units, and he can also pick 2 units and make a 6-inch pre-game move with them, known as a scout move in 10th edition. And this is obviously really, really powerful on infantry units like Exalted 8-bound. It's also really powerful on things like your Chaos Terminators, because they only have a 5-inch move characteristic, so being able to scout move them 6 inches actually gives you more than an entire movement phase with these guys. So there's a few really interesting options there. But the main ability that he has, which is absolutely critical for any combat-based army, is the ability to fall back, shoot, and then charge. Now, when you attach him to a unit of Exalted 8-bound, not only is he giving them the ability to fall back, shoot, and charge, but the Exalted 8-bound have an ability that is likely to prevent your opponent from being able to fall back. And what this means is that you can charge into one unit, kill it, consolidate into another, now you're locked in combat, they can't fall back from that combat, and therefore they can't shoot your Lord Invocatus or your Exalted 8-bound. Then we tick over into their turn, you kill that unit, then in your turn you're free to go and charge other things, and if you fail to kill that unit and you're still locked in combat with it, it's okay, because in your turn you can fall back and then move in and charge again. So the amount of damage that this guy can do is huge with those Exalted 8-bound, and the flexibility that he provides them is also huge. It's also worth noting that the new way of dealing with the Alpha Strike for the 8-bound, previously it was, he gave an aura of +2 to move, so you'd move 11 inches pre-game, and then 11 inches in your first turn for a 22-inch move, and then you go in for the charge. Whereas now you get your pre-game movement of 6, but then in your movement phase you can move 11. Then you can use the stratagem to auto-advance 6 inches. Then if you have the blessings up to advance and charge, you're then free to go in and do that 2d6 charge as well, which essentially means you've got roughly the same threat range. It's just you have to get about it a slightly different way. But ultimately, when you're going up against this, you need to think of it the same. You need to look at where those 8-bound are deployed and imagine they have that same threat range turn 1. They're going to be able to go across the table and do all this damage. But on top of that, they're now going to be locking you in combat, and then in their turn, falling back and then charging back into that combat again. So again and again, they're going to hit you over and over, and it's going to be very hard to shut this down, which is going to be particularly interesting because it's looking like 10th edition is going to be a primarily shooting meta. That's what it's looking like. So being able to dominate that fight phase in a way that shooting armies are going to struggle to deal with is going to be very, very powerful. And I think if wielded well, this is going to win a lot of games. But let me know what you guys think of the Lord Invocatus. He lost his ability to ignore invulnerable saves, so his damage characteristic is a little bit less. He lost his aura of +2 to move, so he's a little bit less of a force multiplier in that regard, but he does buff the unit he's attached to significantly more. So I'd love to know what you guys think of the new Lord Invocatus data sheet. Chuck a comment below and let's get a conversation going. Alright, next up we have a unit that hasn't seen much competitive play in World Eater's forces for some time, but I think this guy is going to see significant tabletop presence going forward, and that is the Daemon Prince. Now, the Daemon Prince comes in 2 different data sheets in the World Eaters Codex. You've got the Daemon Prince, and then you've got the Daemon Prince with wings. These guys are very similar on their data sheet. One of them, the one without wings, has increased toughness, whereas the one with the wings has obviously the fly keyword and increased move. Other than that, their data sheet is more or less identical. The big difference with these guys are the abilities that they bring, and I think this is where they're going to really shine. Alright, so the Daemon Prince with wings has got one really interesting rule going for him, and that is that any units in engagement range with him in the fight phase have to take a battle shock check. So if you're able to get his relatively big base into multiple units, you're going to be able to force battle shock on multiple units, which is really, really cool. But he also has an ability which is really, really interesting, which is basically he gets to select a target at the start of the game, and he gets reroll hits and wounds versus that target. However, if he fails to kill, or if you fail to kill that target at the end of the game, he is automatically removed as a casualty. So he is shamed for not claiming that skull. Now, there's a lot of people out there that are saying this is a bit of a problem because if you select that target at the start of the game, your opponent can just insulate and protect that target and prevent you from getting that kill. However, this is not really a big problem because it does 2 things. One, it's a psychological weapon. You can pick a unit, and now your opponent has to consider that unit more than they otherwise would. This might be a small unit that they might want to throw away, but now they're worried about throwing it away. Or it might be a really durable unit, and now they're like, well, actually, it's not that durable because that Daemon Prince is going to go in and reroll all of his hits and his wounds and do massive damage. So it really does play with your opponent's ability to predict and execute their game plan. But the other thing that this does, which is really simple, is that if this is something that you're concerned about, you can just pick a really squishy unit in their army that you know you're going to kill. It doesn't necessarily have to be killed by your Daemon Prince, so it might just be a unit of guardsmen, it might just be a land speeder, it might be something really insignificant that you know your opponent is going to throw forward, and therefore you're going to be able to kill it relatively easily. It's also worth noting that there's a decent chance that him dying at the end of the battle isn't going to matter. It's not like he dies at the end of a battle round, he dies at the end of the game. So ultimately, who cares? The game's over at that point. You've either won or lost, right? It's very rare that him dying at the end of the game is actually going to impact the total score. So that's the Daemon Prince with wings, but the one that I think is the standout is the Daemon Prince without wings. It's amazing what not having wings can do for you. Alright, so the first thing that the wingless Daemon Prince gets is devastating wounds on any turn that he made a charge. Now, devastating wounds, in my opinion, is the most broken rule in 10th edition, and anytime you can gain access to it, you absolutely should. Being able to turn any 6 to wound into just mortal wounds instead of damage is really, really good, particularly on a bloke like this, who has a flat 3 damage weapon. So being able to go, okay, cool, I got X number of attacks, I go in, oh, cool, I got 2 6s in my wound rolls, that's 6 mortal wounds on the target. Like, that's so good. That's good into big things like vehicles that are tough to wound, but it's also really good into things like Horde, because if you do 6 mortal wounds, well, if they're single wound models, that's 6 models dead. So this turns this guy into a bit of an infantry cleaver as well as a big target hunter. It makes him so much more serious in combat. But the main thing that this guy adds, which is really silly, is he has a 6-inch aura of units within that range gain a 4-up invulnerable save. Now you might be looking at this going, yeah, but I mean, we've got 3-up armor across the board more or less, so what's a 4-up invulnerable save? And this really comes into shine when you consider Jakhals. Now, Jakhals don't have an armor save, like they got a 6-up save, so being able to go, cool, they got a 4-up invulnerable save is a massive buff on those Jakhals. And further to that, Jakhals have an inbuilt 6-up Feel No Pain, which you can buff to a 5-up Feel No Pain with your Blessings of Khorne roll. So now, this Demon Prince on foot is giving a 6-inch aura that's going to result in having very cheap models that have a 4-up invulnerable save and a 5-up Feel No Pain. And they're probably going to be like 7 points a model. That is ridiculously tough for such a cheap model. And then you're going to be able to spindle them off like tendrils. So the idea here is your unit doesn't have to be wholly within, you just have to be within that 6-inch aura range. So I think an interesting list that we're probably going to see is 2 Demon Princes on foot, and they'll sit behind ruins in your backfield somewhere where they can't just be shot off the table. And then from there, you'll have 120 Jakhals, and you'll basically make sure that a couple of Jakhals are next to this Demon Prince and they tendril out onto that objective. A couple of Jakhals next to this one, tendril out onto that objective. And you'll basically just make sure that everything is within range of those guys. So you've just got this ridiculously tough horde. And then on top of that, with whatever points you have left to spare, you're going to be sending in things like Angron, you're going to be sending in things like Eightbound, just to deal those early turn damage to your opponent. And anything that they have that you think can reliably get through your horde, you'll send them in to kill. So that's a really interesting archetype, and that is facilitated largely by the 4-up invulnerable save aura on the Demon Prince without wings. So let me know what you guys think of the Demon Princes. Do you have a preference, the winged one or the one with no wings? I know for sure I take the one with no wings. However, there is an argument to be made for a character that has wings, that can fly, that has 12-inch move, that can advance and charge, that can get +2 to his move from the Blessings of Khorne, that can then go in and reroll all hits and wounds against a selected target. That sounds to me like a unit that's going to go out there and solve problems for you. So there's an argument for that as well. Potentially, you run 3 Demon Princes, 2 without wings and 1 with wings. Who knows? So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, because I'd really like to get your thoughts on this. Alright, next up we have the World Eater's Lord on Juggernaut. This guy has previously been heavily overshadowed by the Lord Invocatus, because previously the Lord Invocatus was such an amazing force multiplier. However, this guy has brought some new abilities to the forefront that make him an interesting and competitively viable option when compared to Lord Invocatus. So let's have a look at what abilities he provides, and let's see what he's worth. Alright, so the first thing that this guy gives, which is unique and very interesting, I won't go into his data sheet, he more or less hits like a brick shithouse and he deals damage in a similar way to the Lord Invocatus, which is just, heavy character damage, but any unit that he's attached to, he's going to be able to provide rerolls to charges, advances, and blood surge moves. Now, I personally think that this guy's best attached to a unit of Khorne Berzerkers for that very reason. Sure, you could attach him to your 8-bound and you could send him in and use their greater movement to gain more utility out of those rerolls. However, being able to reroll blood surge moves can be an absolute game changer. There's been so many times where I've been playing a game where I've needed to roll a 4 or a 5 for my blood surge move and I've rolled a 3 and I'm like, damn it, if I could CP reroll that, I would. If there was a way that I could do something to increase that, I would, because had I rolled a 4 or a 5, I would have made it into engagement range with you and I'd be cutting you down. So that's one way that you can now do that, is by adding the Lord on Juggernaut to your unit of Khorne Berzerkers. So I think that's really interesting. And also, rerolling those advances and charges is pretty spicy as well, particularly given that we have the ability to advance and charge. And I know there's a lot of people going to be saying, yeah, but you have a stratagem that allows you to just automatically 6-inch advance. But it's worth noting, A, that's a stratagem, so it costs command points, and B, it's a stratagem, so you can only use it once per phase. Attaching this guy to a unit is going to allow you to maybe take your 8-bound, move them up, auto-advance them 6, charge them in, whilst this guy moves up with the Berzerkers and he advances them and re-rolls any bad advance rolls, then goes into charge and re-rolls any bad charge rolls. So it allows you to have 2 units aggressively postured, which is really exciting. Let me know what you guys think of the World Eater's Lord on Juggernaut. One of the other things that's worth noting before I do end on this unit is that he's not a unique character, so it means that he's eligible for those enhancements, whereas the Lord Invocatus is not, things like Kharn The Betrayer are not, so he's one of the eligible targets for those powerful buffs, and you're going to want a few of those in your army, which means you're going to want leaders that are non-named characters, and this guy is definitely one of the standout options for that. Alrighty guys, let's take a look at my personal pick for most improved datasheet in the World Eaters book, and that is the Master of Executions. Now previously, this guy was one of my favorites already because he was a 65-point character, he was very, very cheap, and he did insane amounts of damage for that points cost. However, we've got a new datasheet for him, and he now has an ability that he provides to his unit, which is something that the Master of Executions has not done before, and it is one of the best abilities in 10th edition, and that is always fights first. Now the reason that this is so important is because 10th edition is new, and unlike in 9th edition, in 10th, basically, always fights first will go first in the top pool, and you get to pick if it's not your turn. So I guess the best way to think about that is whoever's turn is not taking place always gets to select first from either pool. So you have all of the units lined up that have the ability to fight first, which includes anybody that charge or anybody that has an ability like this, which allows them to always fight first. So you line up all of those units, and whoever's turn is not taking place gets to select first. Then once all of those units have exhausted, you go into the units that don't have the ability to fight first, so your ongoing combats or your units that were charged. And then again, whoever's turn is not taking place selects first from those. And what this means in practical terms is if you have a big unit of Berserkers with the Master of Executions in it, and it gets charged by the enemy, and that's the only combat taking place, you get to fight first, even though they charged you, because both units are in that always fights first pool, and the player whose turn is not taking place, i.e. the recipient of the charge, gets to select first. Which means that those Berserkers are going to be really, really scary to charge. You're not going to want to be charging with them unless you're confident that whatever you charge into them is going to survive the fight of those World Eaters. So this is really, really scary, and it makes Berserkers just a dominating force on the tabletop in terms of combat prowess, which is exactly what they should be. Yes, he doesn't increase their damage particularly, but he does add his acts of dismemberment to the fray, and it's a non-insignificant weapon itself. One of the other things that he does that's really, really interesting is his weapon is Devastating Wounds, and it has precision, which means if your opponent has a character hiding away in a unit somewhere, you can charge this unit in, and he isn't going to have to issue any challenges or anything. He's going to be able to just allocate those attacks to those characters and really go in there and dig them out. And given the fact that he does Devastating Wounds, any 6 to wound is going to be doing 2 mortal wounds. And if you give him one of the enhancements, it's actually going to do 2 plus D3 mortal wounds, which means a single hit that rolls a 6 could be enough to just end most characters in the game. So this guy, I think, is really, really good in that he's a force multiplier. He makes your Berserkers way more scary, and he also gives you the ability to go in and dig out enemy characters and stop them from doing any of their shenanigans. So I really, really like the Master of Executions. I think he's one of the best characters in this book. He's subtle, he's cheap, he tucks into a Rhino well with those Berserkers, and he comes out and makes them so useful in the game. So I really look forward to getting this guy on the tabletop, but I want to know what you guys think of the Master of Executions. Do you think he's really powerful, or do you think Berserkers don't do enough damage to really be worth it because you can't add him to 8-bound or anything like that, so that's one of his weaknesses? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Alrighty guys, now let's look at the core battle line unit for the World Eaters, which is the Khorne Berzerkers. Now, when this was first released, I was a little bit skeptical of these guys because it looked like their damage output had been greatly reduced. However, now that we have the full picture, as always, I've been proven wrong, and these guys go in and actually do a serious amount of damage if you can stack the right buffs and abilities on them. So let's have a look at what they do first, and then we'll talk about some of the ways that you can get more damage out of this unit. Alright, so the Berserkers are going in with 5 attacks that are going to be strength 6 on the charge, of course, and they're going to be doing a fair bit of damage with those attacks. However, the main thing that the Berserkers are renowned for is their Blood Surge move, which is basically every time one of them dies, you roll a d6 and you get to move d6 inches towards the nearest enemy unit, which this can be absolute game changing. It means if you've got those Berserkers on an objective, your opponent can't move in and then shoot you off. It also means you're not going to have to spend command points doing things like heroic interventions, because you're going to be able to essentially use your Blood Surge move to get into combat with those enemy units. So some really, really interesting play with that. It also means that if you're near an objective marker, for example, and your opponent's closer to you, but objective markers in between you, your opponent's going to be disincentivized to shoot you, because if they shoot you, you're going to roll that d6 and you might get on that objective marker. You might get more models on the objective marker than they have, and therefore your objective control of 2 becomes really relevant. You're able to steal those objectives out from underneath your opponent. So there's a lot of different things where that Blood Surge move can be really, really relevant. And I'm also thinking that in an edition where damage output has generally been reduced across the board, there are some outliers where they do serious amounts of damage, more than any 9th edition unit, but in general, the damage output has gone down, which means people aren't going to be wiping the entire unit of Khorne Berzerkers in a single volley. They're going to have to hit you multiple times, which means you are going to get multiple Blood Surge moves, which means these Berserkers are going to be zipping around the table. One of the other things worth noting is that if you attach a character to your Khorne Berzerkers unit, that character effectively now gains a Blood Surge move. So you can get in your Rhino, you can disembark out, you can move, you can get all the way up in their grill, and then if they shoot at you, that character is now going in and doing serious damage as well, which is a really, really interesting way of delivering things like Kharn The Betrayer, delivering things like your Chaos Lords on Juggernaut or your Master of Execution. So I think the Berserkers make for an exceptional bodyguard unit for that reason alone. It's also worth noting that whilst their damage output did, in theory, go down, they did gain access to some really interesting stuff, like, for example, they can get +1 to wound when targeting monsters, vehicles, and characters. Now this makes their damage characteristic go way up. With their strength 6, they're going to go in, and the most marine characters, they're going to be wounding them on 2s. Even the toughness 5 ones, because we're going to be strength 6 on the charge, we're going to be wounding them on 2s, and that's going to mean that we're going to be just putting a ridiculous amount of wounds on them. Doesn't matter how good their save is, eventually they're going to start failing those armor saves, and they're going to die. Especially when you get things like lethal hits from those, abilities, you're going to be doing a lot of damage with these Khorne Berzerkers. So it's not all doom and gloom. I think there's some really interesting stuff. You can also put things like -1 damage on them, which means that those 2 damage shots, it's going to take twice as many to get through. And you can put the 6-up Feel No Pain on them from the first battle round without needing any Blood Tithe points, so you can get them durable from the start. There's lots of different stuff that you can do with the Khorne Berzerkers that we couldn't do in 9th edition. Overall, I think the datasheet has improved pretty significantly, actually. The fact that you can attach characters to it, I think, is the big deal for them. And yeah, I'm pretty excited to get these guys on the tabletop. Let me know what you guys think of the exciting new Khorne Berzerker datasheet. Let's get a conversation going below. I think these guys are really good. What do you think? All right, let's talk about Jakhals now. Now, these guys are one of my favorite new additions to the World Eaters Force. Previously, they were a little bit expensive for what they did. However, in 10th edition, they've got some really, really interesting abilities that, in my opinion, make them almost a must-take. And one particular build, you're going to want to max them out and take as many as you can. So the first thing they have is sticky objectives. So basically, in your command phase, if you're on an objective, that objective remains under your control until your opponent takes it. So that means that you can start a unit of Jakhals on your backfield objective, and in your first command phase, you go, cool, that objective marker is sticky, that is now controlled by me until I say otherwise, and now those Jakhals are free to run off and do whatever they want to do. And it also means that if your opponent goes, cool, I'm going to shoot you with barrage and kill out those Jakhals, it doesn't matter. You hold that objective until they come and take it from you, which is going to be a real critical thing in certain matchups like against Tau and Imperial Guard, where they're going to be hitting you with a ton of barrage. Your Jakhals are not going to survive very long. However, if you can get them onto an objective marker, they're going to stick it, and it's going to be yours for the remainder of the game, which is really, really cool. The other thing that they have is the ability to allow you to re-roll your Blessings of Khorne dice if they're on an objective marker in that command phase, which means you're going to want to deploy them on an objective, so when you make that first turn roll, you're going to be able to not only sticky that objective, but re-roll your Blessings of Khorne rolls. And then you're going to want to move on to another objective, and if you remain in that objective in the next command phase, you'll now sticky that one and get another re-roll on your Blessings of Khorne roll. So they provide 2 really, really interesting buffs, and it's all around being on objectives and objective control. So I think these guys are going to be running around doing that, whilst the rest of your army, your Khorne Berzerkers, your 8-bound, Angron, they're going to be running in and focusing on doing damage to your opponent. The Jakhals are there to clean up, they're there to pick up all the skulls, they're there to draw Khorne symbols in blood on everything that they see, they're there to paint the town red, whilst the Berserkers and Angron, they're there to just lop heads off. They don't want to take the time to go and collect the skulls. They don't want to take time to go and collect the blood. That's what the Jakhals get paid for, and they do an exceptionally good job. Now, there's one in particular build that I think is going to be really, really powerful and is where I'm going to be looking into taking World Eaters, at least in my first games, and that is with max Jakhals. You want 120 of them, you want 6 units of 20 because they are battle lines, so you can take 6 units of them. And then you take 2 Demon Princes without wings. Now, I covered this earlier in the Demon Prince video. However, what this allows you to do is effectively get an army-wide 4-up invulnerable save on 120 models, which means that your opponent is going to have to put 240 wounds through to kill you, which is a ton of wounds. But it gets even better. These guys have an inbuilt 6-up Feel No Pain that with Blessings of Khorne rolls, you can turn into a 5-up Feel No Pain, which now means you're going to have to put an additional 3rd through. So I don't know the maths on that, but it's really high. And basically this is going to make a really, really tough horde of just crazy Jakhals, and they're going to be controlling objectives. They're going to be giving you all of the abilities to re-roll those Blessings of Khorne rolls. They're going to be stickying objectives, so it doesn't matter if they die. They're going to be really, really interesting. They're going to be hard to kill. They're not going to do any damage to your opponent. Don't get any mistakes there, but they are going to be controlling the board. And then basically what you're going to do is you're probably going to have Angron in there, and because they're giving you the ability to re-roll those Blessings of Khorne rolls, Angron's just going to keep coming back every time he dies. You're going to be able to send him to do the damage. He's going to be the dedicated guy going in and killing things whilst they control the board. And then with whatever points you have left over, you're going to be doing various bits and pieces as well. So I think that's going to be a really interesting army straight out the gate. And I look forward to getting stuck into it. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think the Jakhals are good? Or do you think I'm crazy to think that I could put 120 of them in a list and compete against, some of the top armies out there? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. All right, next up we have the World Eaters Terminators. Now these guys took a really interesting side grade in the edition change. They became significantly tougher now. These guys are coming in with a 2-up armor save, they're coming in with a 4-up invulnerable save, and importantly they are now toughness 5, which means these guys are significantly tougher just on their data sheet. They also gained access to a neg1 damage stratagem, which means that those 3 wound models get a lot of utility out of that, because 2 damage shots now take 3 shots to kill you, and 3 damage shots now take 2 shots to kill you. So really, it's only when you're dealing with 4 damage weapons or higher that these guys really worry. And even in those situations, you can put a 6-up Feel No Pain on them. So if they hit you with a 4 damage weapon, you're going to remove one of those by making it into a 3 damage, and then when you roll those 3 Feel No Pain saves, you've actually got a 50-50 chance of having a 6 in there, which is going to mean that that 4 damage shot failed to kill that Terminator. So these guys are really interesting, and they're way tougher than they were in the previous edition. However, their damage output I find quite unimpressive. Their shooting is obviously quite lackluster being World Eaters. They're just going in with, combi bolters, which are hitting on 4s, and you don't have a massive amount of ways to get reroll hits on them. They're doing mortal wounds on 4+ against infantry, which is really cool, but they don't have a massive number of shots, and you don't have any really interesting ways of getting rerolls to wound in shooting with them. So there's nothing particularly interesting in their shooting, and even in their melee, they don't have anything above damage 2, and there's so many things in the game now that have the ability to have neg1 damage, which means even into those targets, you're going to be half incoming damage. So some really, really disappointing combat, and also their unique ability is basically when this unit, when they have suffered casualties, they get a little bit better, and when they've suffered a lot of casualties, they get a lot better, in that they get reroll 1s to wound if they're below starting strength, and they get reroll all wounds if they're like below half starting strength. So the problem with those sorts of mechanics is it's kind of a way of going, okay, I'm losing because I'm getting killed, but now I get a little bit stronger. And those types of unique abilities are generally outperformed by ones where you get reroll hits or wounds against targets that have not taken casualties. You want to be able to increase your damage output against full target things, or whilst you're at full strength, you want to have increased damage output. Having increased damage output after you've taken damage is kind of a concession at that point, in my opinion at least. So I think these guys are somewhat disappointing. Even their things like the Chain Fist, which used to be considered an anti-vehicle weapon, and they used to do really, really well, being able to go 3 damage, being able to use the Red Butcher's stratagem to make it 4 damage, meant that these guys were going in and absolutely mincing vehicles. Now I fear that these guys are going to hit vehicles like a standard Rhino, and they're probably going to bounce. They're probably going to do very little damage to it. So that concerns me a little bit. They are going to do great into your hordes of infantry, even hordes of like intercessors or space marines of that nature. They're going to do great work there, but I feel like that's a role that can be just as easily filled by Khorne Berzerkers. So unless you're looking for a really tough anvil of a unit whose priority is just being tough, then the Berzerkers are definitely something you want to look at. But if you're looking for something that's going to be doing damage, then you want to look elsewhere, in my opinion. Depending on the points costs, of course. If these guys are relatively cheap, then hell yeah, you'll probably take them. But I get the sense that these guys are probably going to be twice as expensive as Khorne Berzerkers, and I would rather 2 Berzerkers over 1 Terminator almost any day. So that's just my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours in the comments section below. Alright, next we have another unit that was a competitive staple of World Eater's armies. This is one that almost everybody took as many as they could fit, and that is the Eightbound. Now, I don't necessarily think that that has changed. I think the Eightbound aren't as good as they previously were because they lost access to some really interesting stuff, but they gained access to some other abilities in other ways. So let's have a look at what they do. Alright, damage output, you'll see, just like everything else, it's slightly reduced across the board. A reduced number of attacks, reduced armor penetration, those sorts of things. However, it is still meaningful damage and it is still scary. They did lose the ability to gain +1 damage from the Red Butcher's stratagem, but they do have the ability to get +1 to wound from the For the Blood God stratagem, so there's some interesting stuff there. They're still going to do serious damage. One of the things that they gained now is a scout move of 6 inches. So you no longer require Lord Invocatus to bring in the lists with these guys. These guys can scout autonomously. Or, alternatively, you could bring these guys and Lord Invocatus and Exalted Eightbound and use Lord Invocatus to scout the Exalted Eightbound whilst you scout your regular Eightbound, and you could throw an entire World Eater's army down your opponent's throat very, very fast. So that's really interesting, and it does make these guys perform slightly different than they did previously because they're no longer tethered to that character. However, they no longer can deep strike. They lost their ability to come in from strategic reserves turn 1, which means that they're not going to be providing that utility, so they really do operate primarily as a scouting unit nowadays. And they also lost, just that raw power, which I think was the selling point for the for the Eightbound in the previous codex. One of the things that they do now, though, that they didn't do previously, was they have an aura ability that buffs up nearby units. So what they've basically got is a reroll 1 to wound aura for friendly units within 6 inches of them. And it's worth noting that this unit, being 6 models, is able to string out in a single file line. They don't need to double up like units of 7 or more, so they can string single file line, and 6 inches from any model in that unit is actually a huge bubble that's going to take up a large portion of the table. So this means that this aura is going to be affecting a lot of your stuff, which is really, really good and interesting compared to characters that provide auras where you've got one model that you've got to measure those to. Units with auras are really, really good. And further to that, if you meet certain criteria, you're going to be able to get reroll all wounds, which is really, really powerful, particularly in an edition where a lot of things got significantly tougher, which means you're going to be failing a lot more wound rolls. So getting full reroll wounds is a massive buff to your damage output. And I think this alone is going to make the Eightbound a really interesting unit on the tabletop. So let me know what you guys think of the Eightbound as a unit. Do you think overall they gained a lot of power and gained a lot of utility? Or do you think they're a little bit lackluster at the moment, given that they lost, a lot of their damage output and that sort of stuff? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Alrighty guys, let's talk about the Exalted Eightbound. These guys received more changes than most units in the index update, so let's have a look at what they do. Basically, they've now gone to toughness 6 like their Eightbound brothers. They lost their 4-up invulnerable save. It's now been replaced with a 6-up feel no pain, and that can be buffed to a 5-up feel no pain with the Blessings of Khorne rolls, which 5-up feel no pain and a 5-up invulnerable save is roughly the same as a 4-up invulnerable save anyway, so more or less a lateral change there. One of the big areas where they've changed is their damage output. So they no longer have access to a stratagem to get +1 to damage on them, which means that they're not going to be going in and doing 3 damage and just cleaving through things like Terminators. And it also means that they are now particularly vulnerable to anything, which there's a lot of, that has -1 damage. So being able to take something that only has 2 damage and make it -1 means you're cutting its damage in half. And because they don't have access to get that +1 damage, they're not able to bring it back up and effectively double their damage. So that's a real concern. Further to that, they lost a number of attacks. So now they're going in with fewer attacks with those chain fists. However, those chain fists are hitting very hard. They're strength 14, 15 on the charge because you're getting a +1 attack and +1 strength from being a World Eater. So they're going in and they're hitting very hard. And they are also AP3, which is going to be particularly relevant in this edition, where there's a lot of 2-up armor saves running around, and a lot of things have reduced in armor penetration, which means that those things that didn't, or those things that do still have that high armor penetration, are going to be particularly valuable because people are going to shift heavily into those 2-up saves, knowing that most people lost their armor penetration. So the fact that these guys kept it and still have the ability to punch through that armor is really exciting. However, I think the most exciting thing with these guys that changed was one of their datasheet abilities. So now they basically still have that aura of can't fall back against them. Every enemy unit within 6 inches in the start of your opponent's command phase or movement phase has to roll a leadership check, and should they fail, they must remain stationary. So it's not like the Warp Talons from the Chaos Space Marines where they have, the reduced capacity to fall back, or they take, the desperate breakout checks when they fall back. This is just, nope, you can't fall back, you must remain stationary, which really does open up an exciting combo. I spoke about this when we talked about the Lord Invocatus, where basically you're going to be able to add the Lord Invocatus to this unit, which allows it to scout move. One of the biggest weaknesses of the 8-bound previously was that they didn't have core, which meant they didn't have access to the Fights on Death stratagem, they didn't have access to Heroic Intervention, and they didn't have access to Lord Invocatus's pre-game move. So that's all changed now because core is no longer a thing, which means you're able to add the Lord Invocatus to this unit, and you're going to be able to pre-game move it. You're going to be able to fight on death with the Blessings of Khorne. You're going to be able to heroically intervene with the stratagems. So you're going to be able to do all of the things that you previously wanted to be able to do. And it's also worth noting that you can now do this with a unit of 6 Exalted Eightbound. It's no longer limited to 3. So you take a unit of 6 Exalted Eightbound, you smack a Lord Invocatus in there. That whole little nugget can pre-game move up into the middle of the table. Then you're going to be able to move. You're going to be able to spend a stratagem to auto-advance 6. You're going to be able to use the Blessings of Khorne to get a 6-inch advance on these guys. So you're going to be going really fast up the table with your +2 to move from Blessings of Khorne as well. They're going to be going in hard. And then when they hit their opponent, they're going to stop your opponent from being able to fall back. Now, the interesting thing there is you can charge, kill something, pile into a couple of other things, and then if any of those things fail their leadership check, they're not going to be able to fall back, which means they're going to stay in engagement range of you, which means enemy units are not going to be able to shoot your 8-bound or your Lord Invocatus because they're locked in combat. Then in your opponent's turn, you're either going to kill the unit that you're touching, or you're going to not kill it, stay engaged in combat, and then because the Lord Invocatus provides fallback, advance, and fallback and charge, you're going to be able to fall back out of that combat, and then either go charge something else, or charge straight back into that combat, and therefore fight first in the upcoming fight. So you're going to be able to do some really janky stuff with the Lord Invocatus Exalted 8-bound combo. I actually think that these guys got significantly better based on the fact that they're now bigger units and they now have access to all of those various stratagems. Even though they did take a significant hit in damage output, they did gain a lot out of the change. It's also worth noting they do gain access to -1 damage from the stratagems. They did gain 6-up Feel No Pain inbuilt without having to do anything. That can be buffed to a 5-up Feel No Pain. This is really interesting against things like Mortal Wounds. 5-up Feel No Pain against Mortal Wounds is going to make these guys 1/3 tougher. So that's really exciting. And I actually think, all things considered, Exalted 8-bound got better in this edition. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see what people can do with them. Let me know what you think in the comment section below about Exalted 8-bound. Do you think they got better? Do you think they got worse? What are your thoughts? All right, next up we have the Worldies Land Raider. Now this is one of my favorite units. I have 3 beautiful Land Raiders that I've painstakingly painted and I love them to death, and it's been really hard to get them on the tabletops because they're not particularly competitively viable previously. However, I think they got a serious glow up in this edition. First of all, they're significantly tougher than they used to be. Very, very hard to put these guys down with that high toughness characteristic and high wounds characteristic. They're just going to be an absolute brick of a unit and very hard to shift. But what they do now, which is something that they did back in, I think it was 6th edition, is the assault ramp rule, which basically means that units can disembark from this and then charge after the vehicle itself has moved, which means you're going to be able to move your Land Raider, it's 10 inches, plus 2 from the Blessings of Khorne, so 12 inches. Then you're going to be able to disembark a unit 3 inches out the front, so you've moved a total of 15 inches before you charge, which is really, really far for units like Terminators. So I think this is really interesting on them, or even units of Khorne Berzerkers. Being able to use a Land Raider to project these guys up the table is going to be really interesting. And further to that, there's multiple things in this World Eaters book that get an advantage against a target that has taken damage. So having those Soul Shatter las cannons be able to go, cool, I'm going to put some wounds on that unit down there, so it's no longer at full strength. And then you've got various things that gain benefits when targeting things that are below starting strength. So I think the Land Raider is definitely something that is worth looking into for the World Eaters. It particularly pairs well with them because it's able to protect your squishier units, keep them alive, and provide significant firepower downrange. It's also worth noting that they're pretty easy to get cover on these guys because, being a big model, if any part of your model is obscured by a piece of terrain, you're going to be getting cover. And that means that these guys are going to have a 2-up save with cover, which means, high AP weapons, you're still going to be getting a decent save against them. And you're going to be putting back firepower with your high AP weapons, which is really interesting. And I just think they're a really cool unit that's going to pair really well with the World Eaters, and their new ability to move, disembark, and then charge is going to make them a serious combat threat on the tabletop. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you think the Land Raider charge is back? Or do you think we're still going to be resorting to the Rhinos because the Rhinos are a little bit smaller, easier to hide, cheaper, those sorts of things? I think there's a valid argument for both. Potentially a list that contains both so that you can do both things is interesting. But I'd love to know what you guys think. Let me know in the comment section below. Alrighty guys, let's talk about the World Eaters Forgefiend. Now I know we don't typically think about shooting units when we think about a World Eaters army. However, I think the Forgefiend is very interesting, particularly in a World Eaters list. It does something different than it does in your traditional CSM lists and the other CSM factions. The World Eaters one has a really interesting ability that's going to make it really, really dynamic in the way that it integrates with your World Eaters army. So first, let's look at its damage output. It's got ectoplasma cannons. I rate them over the Hades autocannon, depending on the points, of course, but assuming they're the same or roughly the same, I think you're going to go with the triple Hades autocannon, which means you're going to be getting 3d3 shots, and each weapon is blast, which means if you're targeting a unit with 10 models, each one is going to get an additional 2 shots. So you're going to be getting 3d3 plus 6 for an average of 12 shots. So it's getting a lot of those shots. They're high strength, they're high AP, and they're high damage. This is one of the few areas of the World Eaters where you're getting 3 damage shots. A lot of the 8-bound, the Berserkers, even the characters are doing 2 damage with their attacks. So being able to do something 3 damage from range is really interesting. The most interesting thing on this data sheet is that any unit that was hit by one of those attacks has to take a battle shock check at the end of that phase. And basically what that means is that you're going to be able to shoot enemy units, and then if you do wounds to them, they're going to be battle shocked, which means your opponent can't use stratagems on them, which means your opponent can't fire Overwatch, which is something that terrifies World Eaters. Your opponent can't use the counter-offensive stratagem, which is going to allow them to interrupt the sequence of combats. Your opponent's not going to be able to heroically intervene, which is going to stop them from stealing objectives off you, or stop them throwing something even more scary than your units into a combat, making it difficult. It's going to allow you to pick off their weaker things. There's tons of things that this is going to be able to do just by battle shocking your opponent in your turn. Yes, when it gets into their command phase, they're going to revert back, depending on if they pass their checks and whatnot, which means that it's not going to stop them from scoring their primary objective, but it is going to stop them from doing things in your turn. And it's also going to mean that they're going to be objective control 0 in your turn. So if there's an objective that you have to take from them, but you don't have, you don't care if they can take it back, you just need to take it from them in this turn in order to score one of your secondaries or something of that nature, this is going to help you out with that as well. So there's some really interesting stuff here by being able to deliver battle shock checks on enemy units from range in your shooting phase. So let me know what you guys think. Do you think the Forgefiend is worth it? I think he does interesting damage. I think he has interesting utility in the way that he's able to do those battle shock checks. However, I don't know, maybe you want to go pure combat with your World Eaters and forego shooting entirely. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. All right, next we have potentially my favorite unit in the New World Leaders book, and this is one that has not caused insignificant drama and controversy online, the Hellbrute. Now, this guy is something that I've been having a lot of fun with in the previous edition, but he gained a new ability that's very, very interesting and has brought up some interesting rules debates already. So let's have a look at what this guy does. All right, so there's a few things on his datasheet that are interesting. He's toughness 9, 8 wounds, but he has got an inbuilt 2-up armor save, which is very interesting in this edition because AP is generally going to be lower across the board, which means this guy's going to be getting saves against most incoming attacks, which means he's a fair bit tougher than he previously was, and that's going to be really important in a moment. All right, he has some really interesting war gear options. This guy's probably the most flexible unit in the book in terms of weapon loadout. He's got all different types of guns, all different kinds of combat weapons. What I think is going to be the most competitively viable is double fist with heavy flamer in the palms. I think this is going to be really, really interesting, particularly because of the ability on this guy's datasheet. There is an argument for something like the las cannon or the multi-melter in order to get some ability out of that as well, but I think depending on how this all pans out and what ruling ends up going forward, the heavy flamers and the power fists is going to be really interesting. The power fists giving him reroll wounds because they count as twin linked, and then the heavy flamers giving you the ability to fire out multiple rounds of D6 auto-hitting weapons. It's going to be really, really interesting. But let's have a look at that rule on his datasheet and talk about some of the implications. All right, so basically what it does is every time an enemy unit targets the Hellbrute, after it's finished making its attacks, the Hellbrute can shoot as if it were the shooting phase or fight as if it were the fight phase. Now, there's a lot of people saying, cool, what you do is you take the missile launcher and the las cannon and you sit him on the backfield, and if anybody tries to shoot him, he just gets to shoot back. And there's no limit on how many times you can do this. So every time they hit you, you shoot back. They hit you again, you shoot back. Which means people are only going to shoot you if they know they can kill you in one volley, because there's no point just throwing throwaway damage into him. But in this edition, it's looking like that's exactly what's going to be required. Even big things like las cannons, it's going to take multiple las cannons to kill this guy, which means he's going to get multiple rounds of las cannons back into you. So that's one way that people are talking about running him. However, I'm more interested in the fight ability. Now, basically what it is every time an opponent targets you with an attack, they don't even have to make the attack, they just target you with an attack. When they're finished making their attacks, you get to fight. So in the core rules, it does specify that a unit cannot fight more than twice. However, in 40k, it is a general understanding that anything written in a codex overrules anything in the core rules. That's how we are allowed to, for example, set things up in Deep Strike and bring them in turn 1 if they're a drop pod, for example. Or, there's numerous examples of things that are written into a codex that specifically and explicitly overwrite the core rules. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's how this is going to work, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's how this should work. However, there is a strong argument that rules as written, this guy will be able to fight multiple times, because his datasheet specifically says every time your opponent targets you, after they've finished making their attacks, you get to fight. So that overrules the rule in the core rules that specifies you only ever fight once. And basically what this means for the Hellbrute is you're going to charge into your opponent, you're going to fight them, then they're going to fight you back, then you're going to fight them again, because they've just allocated attacks onto you, or they've selected you as the target of an attack, and therefore after they resolve their attacks, you get to fight again. Which means the Hellbrute is going to be fighting twice at least, right? But it gets really interesting where because he's got a decent sized base, if you're able to charge him in such a way that he ends with an engagement range of multiple units, let's say there's 2 units nearby, maybe it's a rhino and some guys that jumped out of the rhino, you're going to be able to move in and tag both, fight into the guys that jumped out, kill a bunch of them, then they fight, then you get to fight again, you fight into those guys again, kill the rest of them. Now you're still engaged with the rhino, that rhino now must attack you, and therefore it's going to hit you, and you're going to get to fight again into the rhino. So being able to just go fight, 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 every time somebody touches you, you get to fight them back, is just going to be an absolute nightmare for combat armies to deal with. Being able to fight multiple times with this guy, effectively unlimited number of times, is just insane. This becomes even more pronounced if you kill the unit that you're engaged with. So say there's a unit of 5 scouts or something like that, and you go in, you fight them, they fight back, you fight again and kill them, and now you're free to consolidate. So you consolidate and you tag something else, it fights into you, you fight, kill it. Now it's dead, so you get to consolidate again as part of your fight. You consolidate into another unit. it now has to fight you, which means you get to fight again. And you could send this guy in like a pinball that just goes in and wrecks up their backfield. So this is definitely something that you want to get clarified with the tournament organizer at any event that you go to, and hopefully GW addresses this with an FAQ early. This is not the only unit that does it. There's a few units in the game that have this. One would suggest that this is the case because obviously there's no limit on how many times he can shoot. Nowhere in the core rules does it specify you can only shoot once. And the fight once, it seems to me like that's designed to stop people from just trying to fight over and over and over. Like, it's not a hard rule. It's specifically overridden by the ability on this guy's data sheet. And most abilities specify, the idea is that they overrule, If you've got an ability that lets you shoot in your opponent's turn, well, nowhere in the core rules does it say you can shoot in your opponent's turn. So it's a bit ambiguous, and I definitely think it's worth reaching out to your TO in advance and just saying, hey mate, just wanted to clarify that is this how this rule works? And if they say yes, because they're following rules as written, and that is how it is written in the book, well then 3 Hellbrutes is straight away one of the interesting things that I think a lot of people are going to want to plug into their lists, because you can just go in and go crazy with these guys. And those fists do significant damage. They get reroll wounds, so they're going to be killing those big chunky targets. You can advance and charge with these guys. You can heroically intervene with these guys. You can, do all kinds of crazy stuff with these Hellbrutes. So I think that's a really exciting way of running them, and I think this is a really interesting unit for that reason. An argument could be made that you could go, I'm going to have, the Dakka version, or maybe a mix. Maybe you have a couple of Dakka ones and a couple combat ones, or up to 3 total. I think it'll be interesting to see where people land on that. I personally think just having full combat pressure is the most fun way to run World Eaters, at least. So being able to just throw those Hellbrutes out and be like, yep, cool, he's going to fight you and then fight you and then fight you and just run through your lines, means your opponent's going to have to deal with them, which means they're not firing those guns at your other units. So let me know what you guys think, particularly on whether or not you think this is a legal option and whether or not you think this is the direction they're going to go, or do you think this is a bit excessive, a bit cheesy, and a bit, power gamer style. I think definitely is something I wouldn't do in casual games against, friends or whatever, or, pick up games at a game store or something like that. However, for the purposes of competitive tournaments, I see no reason why, rules as written, this is not allowed. And I think, given some of the other crazy combos that we're seeing coming out of other codexes, I don't think it's particularly unfair or unbalanced either. I think it's an interesting one. It's going to be difficult to execute, but if you are able to execute it, it's going to be really, really cool. All right, now let's talk about a long time favorite of mine, and that is the Maulerfiend. This guy has been bad pretty much ever since he first came out. This model has never been particularly competitively viable. However, I reckon 10th edition is going to see that change. So he's got a 10-inch movement characteristic, which is the first thing that's interesting. You can bump that up to 12 inches with your Blessings of Khorne. Then you can advance and charge with this guy, which means you're going to be able to go, cool, he's now moving 18 inches, turn 1. Then on top of that, if Angron happens to be nearby, he can then do a 2d6 charge with +1 to that charge roll. He's going to be flying across the table faster than ever before. And also, if he happens to declare that charge against an enemy unit that is below its starting strength, he's going to get a further +2 to that charge roll. So this is where comboing him with something that provides damage from range is going to be really interesting. Because you can basically go, cool, where's my target? Who do I want that Maulerfiend to get into? Fire a las cannon into it, from your Hellbrute, or from your ectoplasma cannons from your Forgefiend, or whatever. Fire something into it, do some wounds to it, and now it's bleeding. The Maulerfiend can hunt that down, and you're going to be just sending this guy across the table at absolutely crazy speeds. Now, it is worth noting that he does still have to move around terrain, and he does have a relatively big base, which is going to make this difficult. And it's also worth noting that because of his big base, it's relatively easy for your opponent to screen him out and prevent you from, moving into where you want to move. So it's not necessarily that powerful if your opponent is planning around it and is able to block you. However, it's something that your opponent has to respect, your opponent has to plan around it, and your opponent has to block it. And anytime you can force your opponent to do things and make those decisions is every time that you give them an opportunity to do it wrong. If you do that and you basically create all these probabilities where it's like, okay, if you're so focused on making sure that you block out that Maulerfiend, it's entirely possible that you're going to forget that this unit of 8-bound can now slide through that gap that you left and do a similar thing with their scout move and their pre-game and all that sort of stuff. So being able to go, cool, I've got a Maulerfiend on this side of the table, I've got maybe a Lord Invocatus with some Exalted 8-bound on this side. Where do you want to block? Can you block at all? How do you know? So being able to do those sorts of things is going to be really, really interesting. And I think the Maulerfiend now is just going to be coming out like a bat out of hell. He also does serious damage when he gets into melee as well. So being able to get buffs like reroll wounds from 8-bound nearby, or being able to get things like +1 to wound from stratagem support, means that this guy's going to be bringing things down very easily, and he has a very high number of attacks as well. So he's a really good solution to your opponent's hard targets. He's a really good solution to big hordes of units. He's fast, he does a lot of damage, he's really, really cool, and he's also pretty tough compared to previous versions of him. So I'm a huge fan of the Maulerfiend in 10th edition, but let me know what you guys think. Do you think this is finally the edition that we're going to see the Maulerfiend on the table? Do you think that that Alpha Strike potential with the 10-inch move, the +2 from the Blessings of Khorne, the +6 from your auto advanced stratagem, then the +2 from being able to charge something that's taken damage, the +1 from Angron being nearby, and then your 2d6 charge on top of that, do you think that that's a significant enough threat range to really keep your opponent honest and force them to make those sorts of decisions? Or do you think people are going to be like, lol, Maulerfiend, that's cute, and not really care? I'd love to know what you guys think. Obviously, still very early in the edition, so figuring out what the general consensus is going to be a really important part of what this channel is aiming to do. So let's have a conversation in the comments below. Alright, the Chaos Spawn are the next ones that we're going to look at, and these guys have taken a significant sidestep in the edition change. So they previously were a unit that would take a lot of units of 1, they'd sit on backfield objectives, they'd be relatively insignificant, and they were mainly there as an easy thing for your opponent to kill so that you would score those Blood Tithe points. Now that Blood Tithe is gone, that's not necessarily as relevant. However, these guys got some interesting stuff. Now you must take them in your unit of 2, you can't take them as 1, and you can't take them as 6. So they really do fill an interesting role where they're not cheap enough potentially to be that insignificant unit that holds backfield. You're going to want to get some value out of them, but you also can't make them big enough to know that you are definitely going to get that value. So that's really interesting. They also, their ability to regenerate wounds is now capped at D3 per phase. So instead of being able to go, cool, I took my damage, but then I just heal back to full health, now it's only a D3. So your opponent's going to be more likely to chew through you. That being said, one of the new things that they got was a 5-up Feel No Pain save, and then you can turn that into a 4-up using the Blessings of Khorne. And a 4-up Feel No Pain is actually really, really good, and it's quite rare in this edition. So having a 4-up Feel No Pain means that you're going to be shrugging off a lot more wounds than you previously would, and it also means that they're going to survive a little bit more than most people would expect. And I think a lot of people are going to underestimate the durability of the Chaos Spawn. They're going to send in something really insignificant, and they're just going to bounce off of it. And you're going to be left thinking, wow, my spawn are surviving stuff that they really shouldn't. And anytime you have that sort of disparity in expectations, where what they're expecting to do, they don't do, and it works out in your favor, and what you're expecting a unit to do, it exceeds in your favor, those are the sorts of situations where you can win games by going, you know what, I'm going to leverage the fact that my things are performing better than expected, and your things are performing worse than expected. And I think 2 Chaos Spawn on a backfield objective somewhere, out of line of sight, is actually going to be significantly more difficult to deal with than what your opponent is likely to invest into that. So I think Chaos Spawn are interesting. I definitely don't think they're going to be as popular as they were, but I think they've definitely still got a niche in lists. Let me know what you guys think of the Chaos Spawn. Do you think this is something that people are going to take? Do you plan to continue to take them? Or do you think you're going to lean into things like your Jakhals as your backfield objective campers, who die easier, but they have some different abilities and some different utility that the Chaos Spawn no longer have? Generally speaking, both of these units are going to be filling those backfield objective camper roles, and I think there is an interesting debate to be had over which ones you include. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that debate in the comments section below. Alright, last but not least, let's have a look at the big dog himself, the Khorne Lord of Skulls. Now this guy is a massive toughness 13, and he's got a huge wounds characteristic to boot. This guy is going to be very difficult to shift, especially when you factor in that in the new World Eaters datasheets, we have access to neg 1 damage, and we have access to a 6-up Feel No Pain save. So he's going to be really, really tough. All of this guy's weapons, both in melee and shooting, do significant damage as well. So I'm expecting this guy to be quite expensive in points cost, just because he's got that flamer that's going to torrent and burn things to death with flaming blood or whatever. He's got the big cleaver that's going to be chopping away. He's going to be killing a lot. And that's going to benefit us greatly when we look at his unique ability, which is that in the start of the battle round, when you go to make your Blessings of Khorne roll, you get to modify a number of dice equal to the number of units that he killed in the previous battle round by +1 or -1 on your Blessings of Khorne roll. So basically you roll your 8 dice, and then you go, cool, how many units did he kill last turn? Oh, he killed 2? Cool. I get to pick 2 of those dice and increase or decrease them by 1. Now, when you factor in that you can also re-roll all 8 of those dice if you take the enhancement for re-rolling your Blessings of Khorne, and you can re-roll individual dice based on the number of Berserkers or Jakhals you have on objective markers, you're going to be able to go, cool, I'm going to roll all 8 dice. If I don't roll enough 6s, say you roll 1 or 2 6s, you'll keep it. If you don't, you're just going to re-roll the whole lot, see how many 6s you roll. Then, for every Jakhal or Berserker you have on an objective marker with an icon, you're going to re-roll one of those dice that's not a 6. Then, any 5s that you roll, you're going to use the Lord of Skulls to turn them into 6s. The probability of you getting 3 6s has just gone way up. I'm no mathematician, and I, honest to God, couldn't even think about how you would go about calculating that, because you would need to know how many guys this guy is likely to kill, you'd need to know how many Berserkers you're likely to have on objectives, you'd need to know the probability of rolling those dice, those 6s with 8 dice, and then re-rolling them. There's a lot of factors to work in there, so if any of you guys feel like digging through the maths codexes and figuring that shit out, by all means, let me know in the comment section below what the probability is, but I'm tipping it's high. I'm tipping it's probably around maybe 30 to 40% likely that with all of that involved, you're probably going to get 3 6s that you need to resurrect Angron. So I can see lists definitely containing a single Lord of Skulls, Angron, a bunch of Berserkers, a bunch of Jakhals, and that's the list. And that way you're basically going to be able to use Angron hyper aggressive, because you know that he is going to die, because your opponent has to deal with him because you're throwing him into him, but he's also going to come back over and over, and every time he comes back at full health, and that's going to be just a pain in the ass for your opponent to deal with. And the Lord of Skulls itself is no waste of points. You know, he's going to do significant shooting damage, significant combat damage, and he's tough as hell as well. So this means you've got 2 super tough elements on the tabletop that are going to be able to do serious work. So I really like the Lord of Skulls. I think it's a beautiful model. It's really cool. It's very unique, and it's very Warhammer. You know, like there's a lot of units out there, like, you know, the Tau Riptide, for example, that doesn't really scream Warhammer to me. It's, you know, it's not silly. It's not over the top. It's just sort of a bit of a Gundam suit, or, you know, some of the guard tanks. You're like, yeah, cool. It's like a tank, you know. Whereas this is like, you're saying it's a demonic lawnmower with a fucking big axe. Like it's a vehicle that holds an axe in a hand, but it's a vehicle. But it's got these tanks of blood on its back, and it's got these tank tracks, and it's like, it's just the most fucking ridiculous thing ever. You know, it's so silly, and I think it just screams World Eaters, it screams Warhammer 40k, and I love them to death, and I'm really glad that it's got this really interesting data sheet, and I think it's going to be really interesting. It depends on how many points it is, of course. We don't know the points costs yet, and even when we do get them, those points costs are going to change every 3 months when they do the balanced data slate, so who knows whether this is going to be competitively viable, and if it is, who knows if it will stay competitively viable. But I think it is going to be at least interesting from the perspective of its data sheet and its ability to impact those, you know, Blessings of Khorne rolls. And yeah, I think it's going to be real interesting. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Alrighty guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, all of that good stuff, and head over to blogforthebloodgod.com, where you can show your support for this channel by joining our Patreon, joining our Discord community, picking up some merchandise. There's all kinds of really cool stuff over on that website, so please check that out. Thanks again for tuning in. I really do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Cheers.
Log for the Blood God.
Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel